before the stadium lights, before massive TV contracts, and before the Super Bowl became a national holiday, professional football lived on a razor edge. Small-town teams, unpaid players, and loose schedules left the sport vulnerable to the oldest temptation in sports money. Gambling rang through the same neighborhoods that filled the stands. And sometimes, the line between a bet and a bribe was dangerously thin. Imagine miners in Pottsville cheering as their team rose to national attention. Imagine the roar at a packed wooden grandstand where a win meant pride for a town and a paycheck for a family. Now imagine that joy threatened by games whose outcomes could be bought. That threat was real, and the choices made then shaped the NFL you love today. The story starts with human moments. Players with second jobs who played for the love of the game and the hope of a better future. Owners who took risks to keep teams alive. Reporters who tracked suspicious results. Fans who refused to accept a rigged outcome. Those everyday actors created pressure for change precisely because they cared. A crucial year was 1925. A small Pennsylvania team called the Pottsville Maroons topped the standings and celebrated like champions. Yet controversy followed when league rules were broken in ways that still spark debate. The decision to strip Pottsville of a claim to the championship left fans and historians arguing for decades. That controversy is not a footnote. It is a turning point in how the sport defined fairness. Another scandal exposed how fragile early professional football really was. The Chicago Cardinals played a game where high school players took the field for a rival team under false names. This scheme was meant to manufacture a weak opponent and pad records. The revelations showed how easily competitive integrity could be undermined when oversight was minimal. 2 decades later, the stakes rose sharply. Legendary championship games meant money, fame, and civic pride. In 1946, a gambler tried to influence the most important game of the season. The attempt to bribe players before the title game led to arrests, trials, and suspensions. The courage of people who blew the whistle and the swift legal response sent a powerful message that the game belonged to fans and not to those who would manipulate it. These events mattered because the NFL in those years was not yet a national institution. It did not have billions of dollars in television contracts or a centralized authority with sweeping power. Each scandal risked the public trust that would be necessary for the league to grow. When credibility faltered, the sport could have withered. Instead, the league, its fans, and civic institutions pushed back. This documentary will not sensationalize the past. It will present facts, archival reporting, courtroom records, and careful attribution of investigative claims. At the same time, it will celebrate the resilience of the sport. Out of crisis came stronger institutions. We will meet the people who mattered. Miners and factory workers who filled seats in blue-collar towns. Players who risked reputation and livelihood when they resisted bribery. Owners who chose governance over short-term advantage. Reporters whose headlines mobilized public outrage. The human stories reveal how much the game meant and why its integrity became non-negotiable. We will walk through evidence. Box scores that did not add up. Newspaper headlines that demanded accountability. Court transcripts that show the legal framework used to punish corruption. Historians and archival experts help contextualize claims about organized crime and gambling. Where accusations cross into interpretation, we will label them as investigative findings and present counterviews. The film will show how broader social forces shaped the moment. Prohibition-era networks, economic hardship, and the rise of organized betting created fertile ground for corruption in many public life arenas. Not only sports, comparisons matter. Baseball's 1919 Black Sox scandal reshaped the way Americans viewed sporting integrity. Football watched and learned. When baseball seized the narrative with hard reforms and a new commissioner, the rest of professional sport had an example of how to restore public faith. Football's leaders adopted similar tools to protect competition. This story is not a history of failure. 'Tis a history of reform. It shows how mistakes and exposures forced institutions to clarify rules, strengthen oversight, and compel accountability. The evolution of commissioner authority, the tightening of roster rules, and the development of anti-gambling policies are testaments to a sport determined to earn the trust of its fans. The film also separates myth from record. Some narratives suggest that organized crime ran professional football. Investigative reporting raised important questions about business ties and shady enterprises. And those investigations deserve scrutiny. Our approach is careful. We trace verified business dealings, documented prosecutions, and archival material. When claims are disputed, we present the debate and allow viewers to judge the evidence. Audiences will learn why early players were vulnerable. Payouts were small. Job security was limited. For many athletes, a single paycheck mattered. That economic reality helps explain why attempts to fix games occurred. It also makes the resistance by players who refused bribes even more admirable and heroic. The film will highlight a decisive legal drama from the 1940s that demonstrated the limits of what could be bought. When gamblers tried to fix a championship, they faced not only league discipline, but criminal charges. The resulting prosecutions made clear that manipulating sport was a crime against the public interest and against the fans. Archival imagery will bring the past to life. Grainy photographs of packed crowds, typed box scores with smudged ink, and candid portraits of players with calloused hands. Those images connect us to people who loved the game before it became a national spectacle. The visual record underscores that this is our history. Throughout the narrative, we will keep a fan-first perspective. Fans are not passive consumers, they are guardians of the game. Their outrage, their letters to editors, their attendance or boycott decisions, and their demands for accountability compelled leaders to act. The story celebrates fans not as bystanders, but as essential participants in the defense of integrity. This hook asks a question that the entire film answers. Could the sport survive when its outcomes were for sale? The answer is yes, because people refuse to let it fail. By telling these stories, we honor the fans and leaders who saved the game. We also remind modern viewers that integrity must be protected every generation. We begin the journey through chapters that unpack the scandals, trials, reforms, and the lives changed along the way. We start with the fragile early years, move to the Pottsville controversy and the Cardinals incident, and then follow the legal drama of the 1940s. The film finishes by explaining how each crisis led to structural reform that built the NFL into a durable national institution. The NFL we see today, with billions of dollars in revenue, worldwide recognition, and legacies that stretch across generations, almost never made it this far. What began as a fragile organization in the 1920s and 1930s faced hurdles so severe that many doubted it would even survive its first few decades. And one of the most dangerous threats to its survival was not the lack of fans, not the competition from college football, and not even the brutality of the sport itself. It was scandal. It was corruption. It was the ugly truth that games could be bought, fixed, and influenced by people who had nothing to do with football glory. The early NFL had a problem that no league can afford. Fans questioned whether the contests they were watching were real. In an era when college football held the reputation of purity and pride, the NFL found itself tainted by whispers of rigged games, bribed players, and shadowy figures with mob money in their pockets. This wasn't just about football. It was about trust. And trust is the foundation on which every sport survives. If fans lose faith that the outcome is real, then the game collapses. That is the story we are about to explore together. A story not only of corruption, but of resilience. Because while the early NFL was bruised by scandal, IT also found ways to overcome, reform, and eventually win back the trust of America. This documentary will take you deep into those moments of near collapse, showing you how close professional football came to being dismissed as a carnival sideshow. And yet, in the end, how it clawed its way to legitimacy. In this video, we are going to uncover the most shocking chapters of football's hidden past. We will begin with the fragile birth of the league in the 1920s, a time when professional football was seen as second-class entertainment compared to the grand tradition of college ball. We will examine how gambling interests and mob connections began seeping into the sport almost immediately, luring underpaid players into questionable deals. We will look at famous early scandals like the 1925 Pottsville Maroons controversy, where off-the-field decisions stripped a team of its rightful championship. We will dive into the whispers of game fixing in the 1930s and 1940s, where players admitted to being offered bribes to throw games. We will analyze how the mob tried to stake its claim in football, just as it had in boxing and horse racing, threatening to poison the sport from the inside. This story will also bring you into the tense atmosphere of the 1946 scandal that nearly destroyed professional football, when two New York Giants players admitted they had been approached to fix a game. That moment was the league's wake-up call. It forced owners, fans, and journalists to ask, can we really trust this league? Or will professional football be forever tainted by dishonesty? But this is not a story of despair. This is a story of transformation. Because each scandal, as damaging as it was in the short term, pushed the NFL to change. It pushed owners to enforce stricter rules. It pushed the league to protect its credibility with an iron fist. And it created a culture of accountability that would eventually separate football from the chaos of boxing, which never escaped the shadow of organized crime. Throughout this documentary, you'll see how scandal shaped the NFL's future. You'll see how legends emerged, not only on the field, but in boardrooms. As men like Bert Bell and later Pete Rozelle realized that the most important thing they were selling was honesty. Fans didn't just want touchdowns, they wanted fairness. They wanted integrity. And if the league couldn't guarantee that, then it was finished before it began. We'll also take you through the cultural backdrop of America in those decades. The Great Depression, World War II, and the booming post-war years all shaped how people saw football. During hard times, sports gave people escape. But when fans suspected the games were rigged, that escape felt like a cruel trick. And so, every scandal cut deeper than just a headline. It was a threat to the bond between players, teams, and communities. But in the most unexpected way, those scandals became part of the NFL's DNA. They forced reforms that other leagues never embraced. They taught the NFL the importance of transparency, discipline, and image. And perhaps most importantly, they showed the league that surviving scandal required building stars who were bigger than the rumors. From Red Grange to Sammy Baugh to later icons like Johnny Unitas, the league leaned on heroes to distract from its darkest shadows. So what can you expect in this video? Here's our roadmap. First, we'll set the stage with the turbulent birth of professional football, where small-town teams and wealthy owners clashed for control of the sport. Then, we'll take you into the heart of the 1920s and 1930s, when gamblers, bookies, and mobsters saw the NFL as ripe for exploitation. You'll hear how teams like the Chicago Bears and Green Bay Packers fought to stay clean, while others weren't so lucky. From there, we'll dive into the infamous Pottsville Maroons scandal, still debated by football historians nearly a century later. Was the league's decision fair? Or was it a politically motivated punishment that robbed a team of its legacy? Then we'll move into the 1940s, when wartime pressures and low salaries made players vulnerable to bribery. And finally, we'll arrive at 1946, the year that could have ended the NFL, when the league's integrity was tested like never before. At each step, we'll explore not just the events, but the impact. What did fans think? How did the media report it? And how did these scandals reshape the league's identity? We'll highlight the pivotal figures who made the difference: commissioners, owners, and players who refused to let football fall into the abyss of corruption. And through it all, we'll maintain one theme. The NFL survived because it fought for trust. It realized that without credibility, football could never compete with baseball, never surpass college football, and never become America's game. Every scandal, every investigation, and every painful lesson paved the way for the NFL's eventual rise to dominance. So, as we move forward, remember this. The story of the NFL's first scandals is not just a tale of corruption, it's a tale of resilience. It's a reminder that the league we know today, with its billion-dollar contracts and global fan base, was once hanging by a thread, nearly undone by dishonesty. But instead of collapsing, it rose stronger. And that's what makes this history so fascinating. Because without these scandals, without these battles for integrity, the NFL might never have become what it is today. Now, let's uncover the fragile birth of the league, where opportunity and temptation walked side by side, and where the NFL's fight for legitimacy truly began. When we look back at the origins of professional football, it is almost impossible to imagine that the sport we see today, worth billions of dollars and broadcast across the globe, was once fighting for its very survival. In the early 1900s, American football was not the polished, glamorous spectacle of the Super Bowl. It was rough, unorganized, and deeply vulnerable to corruption. Teams were small-town clubs, rosters shifted week to week, and there were no clear standards to protect the integrity of the game. And in that kind of environment, scandal was bound to creep in. At the heart of the story lies the tension between amateur ideals and professional realities. College football, already immensely popular by the 1910s, carried with it a sense of purity and honor, at least on the surface. But professional football was seen as cruder, dirtier, and tainted by money. That perception made professional leagues struggle for credibility, and because there was so little oversight. It also created fertile ground for bribery, betting, and outright rigged games. One of the earliest warning signs of how fragile professional football could be came from its chaotic team structures. Players often jumped from one team to another depending on who could pay more that weekend. Contracts were shaky, if they existed at all, and rosters were never stable. That made fixing games easier, because loyalty was fluid and the temptation to take extra cash under the table was always there. By the 1910s, the rise of organized gambling on sports had started to cast a long shadow over football. Baseball, the so-called national pastime, was already under scrutiny after gamblers were caught trying to manipulate outcomes in small leagues. That same culture of gambling soon targeted football. Bookmakers and shady figures recognized that loosely organized professional teams, often desperate for survival, were perfect places to exert influence. The stakes grew even higher in 1920, the year that the American Professional Football Association (APFA) was founded, later renamed the National Football League in 1922. On paper, this was supposed to bring order to the chaos. In reality, the APFA was a fragile experiment. It was made up of a collection of teams from Ohio, Illinois, and other Midwestern states, many run by local businessmen who loved the sport but had no experience running professional sports leagues. They were competing for fans, for players, and for money. The financial pressures on these clubs meant that the door was wide open for corruption to slip in. The most notorious early scandal that rocked this fragile system came in 1920. In a game that would almost forever tarnish the league's reputation before it even began to grow. The Rock Island Independents, Decatur Staleys, and other early teams were trying to establish legitimacy. But when players and coaches were accused of manipulating outcomes and taking bribes, whispers began to spread. Was professional football just a front for gambling operations? The reality was that the NFL's founders were constantly fighting two battles at once. On one side, they wanted to prove that professional football could be just as honorable and exciting as the college game. On the other, they were struggling to survive financially, paying players under the table and competing with other leagues that were just as unstable. That combination made scandals not just possible, but almost inevitable. One of the key elements in these early years was the lack of standardized rules. Today, the NFL is built on precise regulations governing contracts, rosters, and officiating. Back then, referees were often chosen by the home team, decisions were questioned constantly, and accusations of favoritism were rampant. If a wealthy backer wanted a certain team to win, it was not difficult to apply pressure on officials or even bribe players to ensure it happened. Gambling syndicates recognized these weaknesses quickly. In small-town America, where many of these early teams were based, the influence of local bookmakers was enormous. The ties between organized crime and sports betting were already being investigated by authorities, and football provided yet another arena for them to operate. It wasn't unusual for rumors to circulate before a big game that certain players had already been taken care of, meaning the outcome was predetermined. Perhaps the most dangerous aspect of these early scandals was not just that they happened, but that the league had no way of stopping them. The NFL did not have a commissioner at the time. There was no central figure with the power to investigate or punish wrongdoing. Decisions were often made by team owners, many of whom were more concerned with protecting their reputation and keeping fans in the stands than confronting corruption directly. The fragility of the NFL's image was made even clearer by what was happening in baseball at the same time. In 1919, just 1 year before the NFL was founded, the infamous Black Sox scandal erupted. When 8 Chicago White Sox players were accused of intentionally throwing the World Series for money, that scandal nearly destroyed baseball's credibility. For football, a sport still fighting for legitimacy, a similar scandal could have ended the league before it ever truly began. What makes these early years so fascinating is that they were a test of whether football could overcome its own growing pains. Could the league distance itself from shady gamblers and underdatable deals? Could it create a structure strong enough to protect itself from the same fate that nearly ruined baseball? These questions would hang over professional football throughout the 1920s and 1930s, as scandal after scandal tested the league's survival. Fans, too, were caught in the middle of this fragile experiment. They loved the raw, tough play of early professional football, but they also worried about whether what they were watching was real. Whispers of fixed games, strange referee calls, and sudden shifts in momentum fueled suspicion. For a sport trying to win over America's trust, nothing was more dangerous than doubt. And yet, despite all the uncertainty, the NFL's leaders pressed forward. Men like George Halas, owner and player for the Chicago Bears, understood that for football to grow, it had to clean up its image, but it would not be easy. Each scandal threatened to send the league backwards, reminding fans and critics alike that professional football was still viewed as a second-class sport, one step away from being swallowed whole by corruption. The story of these first scandals is not just about the games themselves, but about survival. The NFL was born in an era where bribery, rigged outcomes, and mafia influence were not just occasional threats, but daily realities. The league's ability to endure and eventually thrive would depend on how it confronted these challenges head-on, setting the stage for reforms and the eventual rise of a commissioner with the power to protect the sport. In truth, the first years of professional football are a reminder that the NFL could have easily disappeared before it ever reached national prominence. If the early scandals had been left unchecked, fans may have walked away forever, convinced that football was nothing more than a spectacle controlled by gamblers. The fact that the league survived those first dangerous decades is not just a story of sports, it is a story of resilience, reform, and the struggle to build trust in a world that didn't believe football could last. As we move deeper into this journey, we will see how the scandals grew more complex and how the NFL slowly built the defenses that eventually saved it. But first, we need to understand the scandal that nearly killed the league before it truly began. The infamous 1920 fix that put the NFL's future in jeopardy. But first, we need to understand the scandal that nearly killed the league before it truly began. The infamous 1920 fix that put the NFL's future in jeopardy. The story of professional football in the 1910s and 1920s cannot be told without addressing the shadow of gambling. From the very beginning, bets were placed on games. Money exchanged hands under the bleachers, and whispers of outcomes being decided before kickoff grew louder with each season. In truth, the sport was born in a gambling culture. College games had already been targets of bookies, and once professional leagues emerged, they became the next frontier. In cities like Chicago, Detroit, and New York, gambling was not hidden in alleyways. It thrived openly in taverns, pool halls, and even in the very stadiums where games were played. Fans came not only to cheer their local heroes, but also to put money on the line, creating an atmosphere where the stakes off the field often felt higher than those on it. Football was new, fragile, and searching for legitimacy. But gambling gave it both an audience and a problem it could not control. By the early 1920s, when the National Football League was in its infancy, local gamblers often had closer relationships with players than owners did. Many players were working-class men who earned meager salaries. A lineman might make $50 for a game, maybe $100 if he was a star. Meanwhile, gamblers could offer several times that amount simply to ensure a mistake was made at the right moment. The temptation was enormous and in some cases irresistible. One of the most significant developments of this period was the growing influence of organized crime. The Mafia and local crime syndicates had already controlled horse racing and boxing, and football offered them another lucrative stage. Their approach was subtle at first. Instead of buying entire games, they worked to sway point spreads, encouraging players to fumble, miss tackles, or accidentally allow a touchdown in key moments. This allowed the criminals to manipulate bets without completely altering final scores. For fans, the game still looked competitive. For gamblers, it was a sure profit. The seeds of scandal grew quickly. Newspapers began to report odd results where teams that were heavily favored somehow lost to weaker opponents. The whispers of fixed games started to circulate. But because professional football was not yet the massive industry it is today, few outside the small circle of fans and gamblers paid attention. The NFL did not have the power, the money, or the prestige to enforce strict integrity. The players themselves often justified it. Many came from blue-collar backgrounds, working factory jobs, or laboring in steel mills when not on the field. Football was seen as temporary, a side hustle rather than a career. Why not make a little extra cash on the side? This mindset created the perfect storm for gambling influence to creep deeper into the league. The most infamous example came from the Midwest, where games between teams like the Rock Island Independents, Canton Bulldogs, and Akron Pros were often rumored to be arranged. In some cases, players admitted years later that they had been approached with offers but refused. In other cases, silence suggested guilt. The NFL was aware of these rumors, but rarely acted, fearing that any exposure of corruption would destroy the fragile public trust in the league. Gambling also began to shape fan culture in unique ways. Betting slips circulated in neighborhoods and for many working-class Americans. Putting $1 on a Sunday game gave them a reason to care about this new league. Ironically, the very thing that threatened the sport's survival was also fueling its early popularity. Fans loved the thrill of having something riding on the game, even if the integrity of the sport was compromised. It was during this time that league officials, particularly men like Joe Carr, began to realize the magnitude of the problem. Carr, who became president of the NFL in 1921, was determined to professionalize the sport. He understood that without credibility, football would never reach mainstream America. He saw how baseball had nearly collapsed under the weight of gambling after the 1919 Black Sox scandal, and he feared the same for football. But unlike baseball, which had Babe Ruth to rescue its image, the NFL had no larger-than-life savior yet. Still, Carr tried. He began to implement stricter policies, forbidding players from fraternizing with gamblers and threatening suspensions for anyone caught taking bribes. But enforcement was difficult. There were no modern investigative bodies, no clear surveillance, and little media coverage compared to today. Unless a scandal exploded publicly, it often went unpunished. As the 1920s rolled on, the mob's grip only tightened. Stories circulated about games in Chicago where mob bosses sat in the stands, their influence hanging in the air like cigar smoke. Players knew who controlled the money. Coaches knew too, but they often looked the other way. Everyone was trying to survive, and survival sometimes meant silence. Yet amidst the corruption, football began to build its foundation. Crowds slowly grew. The game was brutal, fast, and unlike anything else in American sports. For fans, the excitement overshadowed the rumors. For players, the hope of bigger paychecks in the future offered a reason to resist the bribes. And for league leaders, the battle against gambling became the central fight for legitimacy. What makes this chapter of history so remarkable is the paradox at its heart. Gambling both built and threatened the NFL. Without it, early fans might not have cared. With it, the sport teetered on the brink of collapse. The struggle to control gambling became one of the defining tests of the league's survival. By the end of the decade, as the NFL expanded into bigger markets and attracted star players like Red Grange, the league finally began to outgrow the mob's shadow. Grange's arrival in 1925 brought massive attention, and suddenly the NFL had something to lose if its reputation was stained. This was the turning point. The league realized that to protect its future, it had to battle gambling with everything it had. The story of early gambling scandals is not one of complete destruction, but of resilience. The NFL's leaders knew they were walking a fine line between collapse and survival. And while the Mafia's influence did not vanish overnight, the league's fight for integrity planted the seeds for the powerful, disciplined NFL we know today. The scandals of the 1920s serve as a reminder that every empire is fragile in its infancy. For football, the battle against gambling was the crucible in which its identity was forged. For football, the battle against gambling was the crucible in which its identity was forged. In the 1920s and 1930s, America was in the grip of prohibition. Speakeasies, backroom deals, and bootleg liquor fueled a criminal empire that extended far beyond alcohol. The Mafia and organized crime families had their fingerprints on boxing, horse racing, and eventually professional football, while the NFL of that era was still fighting for survival. Shadowy figures lurked just outside the locker rooms, offering money for fixed outcomes. This wasn't fiction, it was reality. And the line between sports entertainment and mob theater was dangerously thin. The Mafia had always been drawn to sports betting because it provided them with fast, liquid cash and a near-limitless customer base. Unlike the regulated environment we know today, there were no oversight commissions, no digital footprints, and no accountability. If a gambler had enough influence over a player or even an entire team, the outcome of a game could be scripted before kickoff. This turned professional football into fertile ground for corruption. Some of the earliest rumors centered around players being approached in smoke-filled bars after games. A gambler might slip an envelope under a pint of beer, containing more money than most players would see in a month. Considering that many NFL athletes of the 1920s and 1930s had off-season jobs to support themselves working in factories, running farms, even laboring in steel mills, the temptation was enormous. Why risk injury for $50 when $100 could be made in a single mistake on the field? One of the most infamous stories that circulated involved connections between Chicago mobsters and Midwest football clubs. Chicago, being both a hotbed for organized crime and a rising hub for professional football, became the perfect crossroads for corruption. The city was home to legends like George Halas and his Chicago Bears, but it was also home to Al Capone's empire. For years, whispers floated that Capone and his associates had tried to influence games, not necessarily to destroy the league, but to make quick profits off bets. Historians debate how much direct control the Mafia had, but there is little doubt they were interested. FBI files from later decades confirmed that mob bosses viewed football as a growth market for illegal wagering. While boxing was already notoriously compromised, football had the advantage of being less scrutinized. To the Mafia, that meant opportunity. To the NFL, it meant danger. One chilling detail is how mob-controlled gambling dens promoted certain matchups far more heavily than others. Games between key rivals were pushed as sure bets. And insiders often joked that the point spread was set before the players even warmed up. Of course, not every rumor was true, but the perception alone was damaging. Fans didn't want to believe that their Sunday escape was tainted by mob money. And yet, in many cities, the fear was unavoidable. Perhaps the most telling case came in 1933, when the NFL introduced its first official championship game between the Chicago Bears and the New York Giants. Many held it as a turning point for the league, finally giving it legitimacy. But even then, whispers arose about unusual betting activity surrounding the matchup. While the game itself went on without scandal, the mere association of mob money with football was enough to raise eyebrows. League officials had to confront an uncomfortable truth. As long as gambling remained in the shadows, so too would questions about integrity. The Mafia's interest in football wasn't just financial, it was cultural. Gangsters often saw themselves as celebrities, and rubbing shoulders with athletes only boosted their prestige. For some players, being connected to powerful mobsters meant free meals, free drinks, and the feeling of protection. It wasn't uncommon for athletes to be spotted in nightclubs run by mob families, blurring the line between sports icons and criminal networks. These relationships, even when innocent on the surface, fueled the narrative that football was under mob influence. Despite this dark cloud, there were figures in the NFL determined to keep the game clean. George Halas, for example, was known to have zero tolerance for suspicious behavior. Owners like him understood that if the public lost faith in the fairness of the game, the league could collapse overnight. Quietly, but firmly, they worked to separate football from gambling. Players who were suspected of being too close to mob circles were often released without public explanation. These silent purges were part of the NFL's survival strategy, shielding the league's reputation at all costs. Yet the battle was ongoing. Sports writers of the era often hinted at corruption without ever naming names. They would describe odd mistakes or unusual plays. In critical games, knowing their readers could connect the dots. Some even accused referees of being influenced. With no official investigations and no governing body overseeing integrity, suspicions became folklore. Fans would sit in taverns arguing over whether their team lost fair and square, or whether the fix had been in all along. It is important to recognize, however, that this was not unique to football. Baseball had suffered its infamous Black Sox scandal in 1919, when players were paid to throw the World Series. Boxing was essentially run by mobsters for decades, with fights often predetermined. Compared to those sports, football was the new kid on the block, and thus even more vulnerable. If the NFL had fallen to a scandal of that scale, it might never have recovered. By the late 1930s, the league realized it had to take stronger stances. Public relations became as important as touchdowns. The NFL began emphasizing its values: toughness, honesty, and the spirit of competition. Owners warned players privately about the dangers of gambling associations. And when college football adopted stricter amateur codes to separate itself from betting corruption, the NFL quietly borrowed that model. Looking back, it is almost miraculous that the league survived the Mafia's shadow. Unlike baseball, which was nearly crippled by scandal, football managed to dodge the worst of it, but the threat was always there, hovering in the background. And every time a player dropped a wide-open pass or a referee made a questionable call, fans were reminded of that possibility. The NFL's greatest battle in its early years wasn't just financial, it was moral. Could it convince the public that games were real, outcomes were genuine, and that Sunday football was safe from the underworld? The Mafia would continue to lurk at the edges of football well into the mid-20th century. Betting never disappeared. It simply evolved. But by the 1940s, the NFL had grown stronger, wealthier. and more unified in its fight to protect the game's image. That resilience, forged in an era of uncertainty, became part of the NFL's DNA. The league learned that survival meant vigilance and that fans would only remain loyal if they believed in the integrity of what they were watching. This period of mob shadows may not have produced a smoking gun scandal like baseball's Black Sox, but it shaped the NFL's early culture in profound ways. It forced the league to mature quickly, to recognize the dangers of unchecked corruption, and to fight relentlessly for its reputation. Without that fight, there is no guarantee professional football would have made it to the golden age we know today. Without that fight, there is no guarantee professional football would have made it to the golden age we know today. By the time the NFL reached the late 1920s and early 1930s, the league was at a crossroads. The Great Depression had torn through America, draining disposable income and forcing families to choose between buying groceries or buying a ticket to a ball game. In many cities, fans simply stopped showing up to watch professional football, which meant owners had to get creative to keep the lights on. But creativity often came with compromise, and in some places, compromise meant dealing with the shadowy influence of organized crime. This was a time when the mob controlled everything from speakeasies to boxing rings, and football was no exception. Organized crime had already proven its ability to manipulate the sports world. Boxing, once considered the king of spectator sports, was under the iron grip of mobsters who rigged fights, controlled fighters' contracts, and even dictated who got championship bouts. Baseball had barely recovered from the 1919 Black Sox scandal, where Chicago White Sox players were bribed to throw the World Series at the behest of gambling syndicates. Football, still fragile and desperate to establish credibility, suddenly looked like an easy target for criminal elements who saw opportunity in the chaos. It was in cities like Chicago, New York, and Detroit that the influence of organized crime became most apparent. These were hotbeds of both football activity and mob power. In Chicago, Al Capone's empire wasn't just about illegal liquor. It extended into controlling entertainment and gambling markets. Rumors swirled that games involving Chicago-based teams often attracted suspicious betting lines, with unusually high action placed on games that had little national attention, though never fully proven. The whispers grew so loud that some sports writers questioned whether football was becoming the next victim of mob corruption. Owners desperate for survival often turned a blind eye to the connections between gamblers and players. The reality was simple. Money flowed where the mob directed it, and players who were poorly paid could be tempted by quick cash. In the 1920s, an NFL player might make anywhere between $50 and $150 per game, hardly enough to support a family. By contrast, a bribe to miss a tackle, fumble a ball, or drop a pass could be worth more than an entire week's wage. With no strong commissioner's office and no financial security for athletes, the league was vulnerable. One of the first documented brushes the NFL had with gambling's darker side involved the Pottsville Maroons, a talented small-town team that nearly won the 1925 championship. While the infamous championship controversy centered on a scheduling violation, it also revealed how chaotic and unregulated the league truly was. The lack of oversight created an environment ripe for manipulation. Teams scheduled their own games, owners negotiated behind closed doors, and the league office had little real power. In that environment, it was only a matter of time before outside influences tried to steer outcomes. The late 1920s also saw the rise of high-profile betting scandals around college football, which was far more popular than the NFL at the time. Gamblers targeted college stars, bribing them to throw games or shave points. As these scandals broke into national headlines, fans began looking at professional football with suspicion. If college games were being fixed, why wouldn't struggling pro games be as well? That perception became one of the league's greatest threats. Not just actual corruption, but the belief that games were tainted. By the early 1930s, the NFL knew it had to act, but the mob wasn't going away. gambling dens across the country continued to take bets on professional football, often with odds set by bookies who had inside contacts. Owners faced an impossible balancing act. They needed fans to believe the games were honest. But they also couldn't afford to alienate the powerful figures who controlled much of the sports betting world. In some cases, they even relied on gamblers to drive interest in games, since a crowd with money on the line was more likely to show up and cheer. This era laid bare a critical tension that still lingers in professional football today: the uneasy relationship between gambling and the sport. Nearly a century later, the NFL would embrace sports betting openly, signing billion-dollar partnerships with gambling companies. But back then, the league fought to survive under the weight of suspicion and scandal. Organized crime's shadow made every fumble, interception, or missed field goal look suspicious in the eyes of fans. And credibility was always just one headline away from collapse. Commissioner Joe Carr, who led the NFL through much of the 1920s and early 1930s, recognized this danger. Carr was a strict administrator, attempting to bring order to a league that had once been almost anarchic. He enforced stricter rules, punished teams for scheduling violations, and began emphasizing discipline. Still, he couldn't fully eliminate the whispers of mob influence. Without the financial stability to pay players competitively, temptation was everywhere. His greatest challenge wasn't just building teams, it was building trust. In the end, the NFL survived the 1930s, in part because the league was still relatively small and under the radar compared to baseball or boxing. While gambling scandals rocked those sports, football's limited national profile allowed it to escape the worst of the headlines. But make no mistake, the mob's shadow was present, and its influence shaped the policies that the NFL would later implement. By the time the league grew into a national powerhouse after World War II, its leadership understood just how close it had once come to being controlled or even destroyed by outside corruption. What makes this chapter in NFL history so fascinating for fans today is how much it foreshadowed the league's modern struggles. The same temptations, the same whispers of rigged games, and the same uneasy marriage with gambling remain. But back then, the NFL didn't have billion-dollar TV deals or national prestige to protect it. It was simply a struggling league trying to survive in the shadows of bigger sports and bigger powers. And somehow, despite the odds stacked against it, it did survive. That survival is what sets the stage for the next phase of the story. Because while organized crime cast a long shadow, the NFL would soon face scandals that were even more direct, more damaging, and more public. And these new scandals would push the league to its breaking point, testing whether football could ever rise above its reputation as a sport that gamblers controlled. The tension between survival and integrity, between players needing money and fans needing trust, would define the NFL's next great challenge. And it was in that tension that the league's identity was forged, not just as a sport, but as an institution that had to prove, over and over again, that its games were real, that its outcomes mattered, and that its future wasn't for sale. Because in the 1930s, for many Americans, that question remained unanswered. Was professional football truly a sport of competition, or was it just another stage where the mob pulled the strings? And that question would only grow louder as the scandals that followed threatened to shake the NFL to its very core. When people look back at the NFL today, they see a league worth billions, commanding global attention, with Super Bowl Sunday standing as a de facto national holiday in America. But in the mid-20th century, the league's very survival was hanging by a thread. One of the most dangerous threats it faced was not poor attendance, weak finances, or a lack of stars, it was scandal. And the one scandal that almost shattered the fragile foundation of professional football was the revelation of rigged games and the notorious 1946 betting scandal. The idea of athletes throwing games for money was not new in American sports. Baseball had already been rocked to its core by the 1919 Black Sox scandal, when 8 Chicago White Sox players were accused of intentionally losing the World Series for a gambler's payout. That event almost destroyed baseball's credibility and forced the sport to install its first commissioner, Judge Kennesaw Mountain Landis, to restore trust. Football's leaders knew what was at stake if anything similar ever touched their sport. But by 1946, it was clear that football had its own demons. The game was growing in popularity after World War II, when soldiers returned home craving competition, teamwork, and entertainment. But it was also in a vulnerable position. The NFL was still competing with the upstart All-America Football Conference, AAFC, trying to establish itself as the premier league. The last thing it needed was whispers of corruption. Yet that is exactly what began to surface when New York Giants players were accused of conspiring with gamblers to fix the outcome of games. The scandal involved Frank Filchuk and Merle Hapes, two prominent members of the Giants. In December 1946, just as the Giants were preparing to face the Chicago Bears in the NFL championship game, reports emerged that gamblers had offered the players bribes to throw the game. The stakes could not have been higher, the NFL's championship. The credibility of the league and the trust of fans were all on the line. If the accusations were true, the NFL risked being branded as dishonest and unreliable, no different from a staged carnival act. The league moved quickly. Commissioner Bert Bell, who had taken office in 1946, understood the gravity of the situation. Bell was no stranger to the importance of integrity in sports. A former coach, owner, and one of the architects of the NFL draft, Bell knew that if fans ever doubted the authenticity of the competition, the entire league could collapse. He called an emergency meeting to investigate the claims, interrogating both players about their involvement with gamblers. Merle Hapes admitted that gamblers had approached him with an offer to fix the outcome, though he denied taking the bribe. Frank Filchuk, however, initially denied everything and was still allowed to play in the championship game against the Bears. The Giants lost 24-14, and the timing only fueled public suspicion that something underhanded had happened on the field. Although there was no concrete evidence that Filchuk intentionally played poorly, the damage to the league's reputation had already been done. When the dust settled, both Filchuk and Hapes were banned from the NFL, their careers in ruins. But the punishment was not about the two men, it was about protecting the shield of the league. Bert Bell wanted to send a message. Professional football would not tolerate corruption, and anyone who compromised the integrity of the game would be erased from its history. It was a harsh stance, but it was necessary. The 1946 betting scandal left deep scars, and its impact rippled throughout the sport for years. Fans began to question whether every game they watched was genuine. Owners worried about declining ticket sales, fearing that the public would abandon football the way it nearly abandoned baseball in 1919, and players were put on notice. Even entertaining the idea of fixing a game could destroy their livelihood forever. The irony was that the scandal came at a time when football was just beginning to attract national attention. Newspapers across the country covered the story, splashing it on front pages alongside reports of post-war recovery and the dawn of a new era in American culture. The scandal didn't just threaten the Giants, it threatened the credibility of the entire NFL. Yet, in a strange twist of history, the crisis ultimately helped the league grow stronger. Bert Bell's decisive action convinced fans that football's leadership was serious about protecting the game. By banning the implicated players, he drew a hard line that showed the NFL would not be bought or manipulated by outside forces. In a way, the scandal was a painful but necessary moment of clarity, proved that football, unlike the fixed boxing matches or shady horse races of the era, could still be trusted. It's also worth noting that this was happening in the larger context of American sports and organized crime. In the 1940s, the Mafia and gambling syndicates had their hands in everything from boxing to horse racing to illegal lotteries. Sports were big business, and gamblers were always searching for ways to manipulate outcomes to guarantee payouts. Football was no exception. But the NFL's willingness to expose and punish corruption gave it credibility at a time when many other sports could not claim the same. Looking back now, the 1946 scandal is almost forgotten by casual fans, but its lessons echo throughout the decades. The NFL's modern obsession with integrity policies, its strict rules on gambling, and its constant emphasis on protecting the shield, all trace back to these early scandals. Today, with legalized sports betting becoming a massive industry in the United States, the NFL continues to walk a fine line between embracing gambling, partnerships for revenue, and safeguarding against the same dangers that nearly killed it in 1946. The story of Filcheck and Hapes is not just a story about two players who made poor choices. It is the story of a league that was forced to grow up quickly. The NFL realized that it could not afford even a single crack in its foundation of fairness. In many ways, the 1946 betting scandal was the crucible that hardened football into the disciplined, tightly controlled organization it would later become. For fans, it serves as a reminder that their passion and loyalty depend on one thing above all else: belief in the honesty of the competition. If that belief is ever lost, no amount of touchdowns, Super Bowl rings, or star players can bring it back. That is why, more than 70 years later, the NFL continues to treat gambling scandals with the utmost seriousness. The scandal of 1946 nearly derailed professional football at a critical moment in its rise. Instead, it became a turning point. By confronting corruption head-on, the league laid the groundwork for decades of trust and growth. The NFL's message was clear then, remains clear now. The game is bigger than any player, any owner, or any outside influence. Protecting the integrity of football is not just a rule, it is the very reason the league exists. And so, out of scandal came strength. What could have been the death of professional football in 1946 instead became a moment of rebirth, proving that the sport was resilient enough to endure even its darkest days. When we think about the Mafia's influence in American culture, our minds often drift toward Hollywood depictions of smoky back rooms, suit-clad gangsters, and whispers of backdoor deals that determined the fate of cities. But what if I told you that in the early years of professional football, the Mafia's reach extended far beyond the silver screen and into the very stadiums where games were played? This chapter of history doesn't always get the spotlight, but it was real, powerful, and nearly catastrophic for a sport trying to prove itself as legitimate entertainment. The Mafia's interest in football wasn't accidental. Organized crime, by its very nature, sought profitable opportunities. And few things captured America's attention in the 1920s and 30s like betting. Horse racing had been the goldmine of the gambling underworld. But as football began drawing bigger crowds, the mob saw a fresh opportunity. Unlike horse racing, football games could be influenced not just by referees, but by entire teams, players desperate for money, or even weak organizational leadership. For the Mafia, football was a ripe orchard waiting to be picked. In Chicago, New York, and Cleveland, mob figures began to hover around teams, stadiums, and most importantly, players. Young athletes who weren't yet paid well were vulnerable. A Mafia boss could approach a struggling lineman or a rookie quarterback with an envelope of cash in exchange for a mistake on the field. Drop a pass, miss a block, call the wrong play. Football had hundreds of moments where small decisions could tilt the game's outcome, and gamblers knew it. One of the earliest whispers of Mafia interference in football came in the 1930s when rumors circulated about mob-controlled betting rings using inside information from players. These weren't the highly polished, tightly managed athletes we see in today's NFL. Many of them had second jobs to make ends meet, worked in factories during the off-season, or lived paycheck to paycheck. For a gangster with deep pockets, fixing a game didn't require a Hollywood-style scheme. It only required finding one vulnerable man. Cleveland was a particularly hotbed for this kind of influence. The city's gambling networks had long been tied to organized crime, and football games became another market to exploit. Some accounts suggested that mob-connected figures had friendships with team staffers, coaches, and players, blurring the line between casual camaraderie and outright corruption. In some cases, bookmakers boasted of knowing outcomes before kickoff, a chilling signal that games weren't always decided on the field. By the 1940s, the problem grew more visible. The war years saw the NFL struggling to stay alive, with rosters depleted as players went off to serve. This instability made the league especially vulnerable. At the same time, the Mafia was strengthening its grip on America's sports gambling underworld. They weren't just fixing boxing matches, a crime well documented and scandalous, but branching into the growing world of football. And while the public adored football for its unpredictability and grit, behind the scenes, mobsters tried to turn that unpredictability into predictable profit. The infamous 1946 betting scandal, which we covered earlier, wasn't isolated. It fit into a larger pattern of organized crime, testing the limits of professional football's defenses. Some of the names tied to gambling scandals also appeared in Mafia investigations. The FBI's records in later decades revealed how deeply organized crime had embedded itself into sports betting operations. And football, with its weekly structure and passionate fan base, was a prime target. So how exactly did the Mafia operate within the football world? Their methods often involved three tiers. The first was influencing players, either through direct bribes or through intermediaries posing as fans or friends. The second tier involved referees or coaches, though these were harder to manipulate. The third, and often most lucrative, was controlling the betting lines themselves. Mobsters didn't need to fix every game. They only needed to adjust the odds, spread rumors, or tilt a single play in their favor. It's worth remembering that during this time, the NFL did not yet have the centralized power, oversight, or wealth we see today. Teams were individually owned, some operating out of small towns, and league offices lacked the investigative muscle to combat powerful criminal organizations. Compared to the Mafia, the NFL was David fighting Goliath. The stories of Mafia ties in early football didn't always make national headlines, but their shadow hung over the game. Players knew who the bookmakers were. Coaches heard whispers of shady money flowing into locker rooms. Owners occasionally brushed shoulders with men they'd rather not acknowledge. Yet the league pushed forward, desperately trying to avoid the kind of scandal that had permanently scarred college football decades earlier. And here's the fascinating twist. Instead of collapsing under Mafia pressure, the NFL slowly built its strength in response to it. By the 1950s and 60s, the league adopted stricter policies, enforced bans, and cracked down hard on any association with gamblers. The Pete Rozelle era, later in the 1960s, marked a clear shift, with the commissioner famously declaring that gambling was the single greatest threat to the integrity of football. That philosophy grew directly from the Mafia's attempted influence during the league's fragile early years. For fans today, the Mafia's shadow might seem like a distant curiosity, but its impact is everywhere. The league's uncompromising stance on gambling, until very recently, the lifetime bans of players who accepted bribes. The extreme punishments for even small betting violations. All of these trace back to the era when mob bosses sat in smoky rooms. Betting on whether a quarterback would fumble or a receiver would drop a ball, the NFL's iron wall against gambling wasn't paranoia. It was born from real scars, real threats, and the real possibility that organized crime could have destroyed the league before it grew into America's most powerful sport. This chapter of history reminds us that football didn't just overcome rival leagues, financial instability, or wartime struggles. It also overcame the hidden hands of organized crime. And in doing so, it proved not only its resilience, but its potential to rise above corruption and become a symbol of fairness and competition. Because had the Mafia succeeded in turning football into another rigged spectacle, the NFL would never have gained the trust of fans. And without that trust, the league would have collapsed before television deals, Super Bowls, or dynasties were even imaginable. The NFL survived those years not by ignoring the problem, but by recognizing that protecting integrity meant protecting the future. The Mafia may have hovered like a shadow, but football kept the lights on. building its reputation as a sport where what happened on the field, and only on the field, decided winners and losers. And that's what makes this chapter so important. The Mafia tried to bend football to its will, but instead, football bent the future of sports in America. Toward legitimacy, honesty, and the spectacle that fans still love today. The Mafia tried to bend football to its will, but instead, football bent the future of sports in America toward legitimacy, honesty, and the spectacle that fans still love today. The Mafia tried to bend football to its will, but instead, football bent the future of sports in America toward legitimacy, honesty, and the spectacle that fans still love today. When people talk about the golden age of the NFL, they often start with Pete Rozelle. If early football was plagued by whispers of mob ties, rigged games, and shady deals, Rozelle's era marked the dawn of credibility. Appointed commissioner in 1960 at just 33 years old, Rozelle faced a fractured league fighting for attention against baseball, college football, and the rising world of television. But what set him apart was his vision. He understood that the NFL had to clean house, restore public trust, and market itself not just as a sport, but as America's game. To understand Rozelle's impact, you first need to know how fragile the NFL still was when he stepped into power. In the late 1950s, point-shaving scandals in college football had rocked the sports world, making fans wary of whether games were genuine competition or simply entertainment masked by corruption. The NFL could not afford the same fate. Rozelle knew that any hint of gambling influence, player misbehavior, or team corruption could derail everything. His strategy was clear: root out scandal, enforce discipline, and create a polished brand. One of Rozelle's earliest defining tests came in 1963. That year, star players Paul Hornung of the Green Bay Packers and Alex Karras of the Detroit Lions were both suspended for betting on games. This was not some rumor or whispered story. These were high-profile players admitting to gambling activity. For many commissioners, the temptation might have been to protect the league's stars or sweep it under the rug. But Rozelle did the opposite. He acted swiftly, handing down indefinite suspensions, even though these were two of the league's brightest names. The message was loud and clear. No one, not even the biggest stars, was bigger than the integrity of the game. Fans noticed, broadcasters noticed, and, most importantly, gamblers and organized crime noticed too. The NFL would not bend. But Rozelle didn't just clean up scandals. He built an empire by merging discipline with marketing brilliance. In 1961, 1 year into his tenure, he brokered a television deal that changed sports forever. Instead of individual teams selling their own broadcast rights, Rozelle convinced owners to pool rights together and sell them as one package. This created equal revenue sharing across teams and ensured that small market franchises could survive alongside big market powerhouses. What did this mean for fans? Every city had hope. Every city had stability. And every city could believe their team had a chance to compete without being buried under financial inequality. It was a masterstroke that transformed the NFL into a truly national product. Rozelle also introduced the concept of Monday Night Football, a cultural phenomenon that went beyond sports. Suddenly, football wasn't just for Sunday afternoons, it became a prime-time event. Networks treated it like must-see TV, complete with iconic announcers, celebrities in the stands, and a show-like atmosphere. The NFL wasn't just a league anymore. It was entertainment, woven directly into American culture. When it came to discipline, Rozelle walked a careful line. He was not just a rule enforcer, he was a protector of the league's reputation. He often referred to the best interests of the game as his guiding principle, a phrase that echoed baseball's Judge Landis decades earlier. Whether it was fining owners, suspending players, or even battling the AFL in the early 1960s, Rozelle always placed integrity first. For fans weary of shady games and rumors of mob control, this was refreshing. One of Rozelle's biggest challenges came with the rapid growth of gambling in Las Vegas. while casinos wanted partnerships and promotion. Rozelle remained steadfast that the NFL would not align itself with gambling interests. To modern fans, this may sound ironic considering the league's current embrace of sports betting. But in Rozelle's time, such an association would have been disastrous. The 1946 scandal still loomed large in public memory. And Rozelle knew that even a hint of collusion could undo everything he had built. By keeping gambling at arm's length, Rozelle preserved the NFL's reputation as a clean, competitive, and trustworthy sport. Another major moment of Rozelle's legacy came in 1966 when he oversaw the merger of the NFL and its rival, the AFL. Instead of a fractured market with competing leagues bidding for players and confusing fans, Rozelle created one unified brand, capped off with the creation of the Super Bowl. The very first Super Bowl in 1967 was not the spectacle it is today, but Rozelle had the foresight to see what it could become. By merging the leagues, he not only eliminated a destabilizing rivalry, but also cemented football as the most powerful sport in America. Fans often remember Rozelle for his ability to balance toughness with innovation. He was stern enough to suspend legends like Horning and Caras, yet creative enough to build broadcasting deals that guaranteed long-term growth. He understood that football wasn't just about what happened on the field. It was about what happened in living rooms, on TV screens, and in the hearts of communities across the country. Critically, Rozelle's leadership gave fans confidence again. After decades of worrying whether games were manipulated by gamblers or influenced by the mob, fans could finally relax and believe in the fairness of the product. This faith became the foundation of fandom. It allowed generations of fans to pass down loyalty to their children, secure in the idea that when they cheered for their team, they were watching genuine competition. Today, when people speak of the NFL as the most successful sports league in the world, Rozelle's fingerprints are everywhere. The TV contracts, the equal revenue sharing, the Super Bowl, the culture of discipline. All of it can be traced back to his vision. He may not have erased scandal forever, no commissioner can, but he built a league strong enough to survive them. More importantly, Rozelle's leadership shows a clear break in the NFL's history. Before him, football was often viewed with suspicion, vulnerable to whispers of fixed games and shadowy outside influence. After him, it was polished, credible, and trusted. The kind of league that could unite fans from Green Bay to Los Angeles, from Pittsburgh to Dallas into one national community. Rozelle didn't just clean up the NFL, he gave it an identity, he gave it stability, and he gave fans something they could believe in. In a league that had once been on the edge of collapse due to scandal, Rozelle's era was proof that strong leadership could turn chaos into order, suspicion into faith, and a struggling sport into America's most beloved pastime. Rozelle didn't just clean up the NFL, he gave it an identity, he gave it stability, and he gave fans something they could believe in. By the mid-1960s, the NFL had survived its early brushes with scandal, bribery, and rigged outcomes. But survival alone was not enough to truly transform into America's most trusted sports league. It needed something more powerful than rules, and Commissioner Zet needed the unwavering faith of the public. And that faith would be built brick by brick. Through media coverage that reshaped the NFL's image from a rough and tumble, sometimes shady pastime into a cultural cornerstone that millions could rely on every Sunday. This was the age when television and newspapers became the lifeblood of the league, broadcasting not only games, but also credibility. The NFL was no longer just played on fields across the country. It was now lived in living rooms, watched by families, and debated in coffee shops and workplaces. Media turned the NFL into more than a sport, it turned it into America's story. The league's relationship with media had always existed, but in the early years, it was inconsistent. A scandal could make headlines in one city while barely being mentioned in another. The difference in coverage often left fans confused and suspicious. But as the 1950s gave way to the 1960s, a massive shift occurred. Television ownership skyrocketed. By 1960, Nearly 90% of American households had a TV set, and the NFL saw an opportunity that no previous sport had seized on a national scale. If scandals in the 1920s had nearly killed professional football by eroding public trust, television now offered a chance to reverse that damage and create loyalty on a national level. The game was no longer controlled by whispers in taverns or headlines in a few regional papers. It was beamed directly into millions of homes, with polished broadcasts and iconic voices narrating every play. This was also when the NFL began to package its product differently. Instead of being reactive to scandals, it became proactive in shaping its image. Media deals, particularly the landmark 1962 contract with CBS, changed everything. Suddenly, games weren't just regional, they were national. Fans in New York could watch a Green Bay Packers game. Supporters in Chicago could follow the Dallas Cowboys. This created not only new fan bases, but also new standards of accountability. When games reached audiences across the country, the NFL could no longer afford inconsistencies or whispers of corruption. Transparency became a selling point, and media amplified it. Another critical turning point came with the AFL-NFL merger in the late 1960s, a deal heavily fueled by media exposure. At the time, the NFL was battling the upstart American Football League for players, fans, and credibility. Both leagues leaned heavily on television to promote their brand of football. The merger, finalized in 1970, gave the newly unified league complete control over how football was presented to the public. And with Monday Night Football launching on ABC the same year, football became a primetime entertainment spectacle. More importantly, it became routine. Fans trusted that every week they could sit down and experience the NFL live, unfiltered and authentic. This rise in coverage also coincided with the NFL's efforts to educate and engage fans. Legendary broadcasters like Howard Cosell and play-by-play icons such as Kurt "Gowdy" didn't just call games, they explained them. They brought context, history, and strategy to living rooms, making the NFL more approachable. Suddenly, fans weren't just watching, they were learning. They understood penalties, formations, rivalries, and stakes. This deeper connection created confidence. Fans knew what they were watching, and the clarity of the broadcasts eliminated the suspicion that had haunted the league decades earlier, when rumors of fixed outcomes circulated unchecked. Newspapers and magazines also played a crucial role in this transformation. Sports Illustrated, founded in 1954, became a central platform for long-form football storytelling. Instead of focusing on controversies, and other outlets began highlighting the personalities of players, coaches, and even owners. Profiles of Vince Lombardi or Johnny Unitas gave football a human face. Instead of headlines about bribery or payoffs, fans were reading about leadership, resilience, and triumph. This storytelling, backed by reputable journalism, reinforced the idea that the NFL was not only safe from corruption, but also aspirational. It is impossible to talk about trust without acknowledging the NFL's mastery of film. NFL Films, founded in 1962 by Ed Sabal, changed sports storytelling forever. With slow-motion highlights, dramatic narration, and orchestral soundtracks, NFL Films didn't just show the game, mythologized it. Games were portrayed as epic battles, players as warriors, and seasons as sagas. This artistry elevated football into something bigger than entertainment. It was cultural mythology. By presenting the sport in this heroic light, NFL Films further distanced the league from its messy beginnings. Fans weren't thinking about scandals from the 1920s anymore. They were mesmerized by spiraling passes, bone-crushing hits, and poetic narration that made each contest feel like a chapter in America's story. What's more, this media expansion coincided with a golden era of stars who could carry the NFL's new reputation. Players like Jim Brown, Bart Starr, and Gale Sayers weren't just athletes, they were heroes of the screen. Their talent spoke for itself, but the way media captured their performances turned them into icons. Families trusted what they saw with their own eyes. The more media highlighted the brilliance of these players, the harder it was for anyone to question the integrity of the league. The NFL also leaned into transparency through coverage of its own disciplinary actions. When scandals did arise, such as occasional betting violations or off-field controversies, the league made sure they were reported in a way that showed accountability. The difference now was not whether scandals happened, but how they were handled. Media coverage reassured fans that the league was serious about protecting the game. Every headline about a suspension or fine reinforced that message. This was no longer the lawless NFL of the 1920s, but a league dedicated to fairness and honesty. By the 1970s, the NFL had completed a remarkable turnaround. Less than 50 years earlier, it was a struggling organization nearly crushed by bribery scandals and questions of legitimacy. Now, thanks to media coverage, it had become America's most trusted sport. Fans saw the games live. They read about their favorite stars in magazines. They listened to iconic broadcasters break down plays. And they watched NFL films make every touchdown feel immortal. All of this created a sense of shared community. The NFL wasn't just a sport, it was a national ritual. What makes this transformation so powerful is that it wasn't accidental. The NFL recognized that public trust was its most valuable asset, and media was the tool to protect it. Scandals had taught the league a painful lesson. Once fans lose faith, it is nearly impossible to win them back. But through the combination of television, print journalism, and film, the NFL didn't just restore trust, it built an empire of belief that still endures today. The growth of media coverage didn't erase the league's scandals, but it reframed them. Instead of being the defining feature of professional football, they became cautionary tales from a distant past. The narrative had changed, and the media helped write it. And as we move forward in this story, the next question becomes clear. Once the NFL had secured the trust of fans, how would it handle the challenges of rapid growth, larger audiences, and the increasing pressure that came with being America's #1 sport? When the first Super Bowl kicked off in January of 1967, few could have predicted the spectacle it would become. At that time, it was billed simply as the AFL-NFL World Championship game, a one-time experiment to see if the champions of the two rival leagues could generate fan interest. The Los Angeles Coliseum was barely two-thirds full. Television coverage was strong, but nowhere near the cultural phenomenon we know today. Yet behind that moment was a monumental shift in the way the NFL approached its mission. The Super Bowl was not only about crowning a champion. It was about building a symbol of integrity, spectacle, and unity for a sport still shadowed by its troubled past. The NFL understood what was at stake, for after decades of rumors, whispers of rigged contests, and Mafia influence, this new championship needed to feel untouchable. Every detail was scrutinized, from officiating to broadcasting to the security around the teams themselves. Fans could not be left wondering whether the big game was on the level. Commissioner Pete Rozelle, already seen as a visionary, treated the Super Bowl as a showcase for credibility as much as competition. He wanted it to be football-esque declaration that the era of backroom deals and quiet scandals was over. As the first few Super Bowls played out, the league leaned into this philosophy. Games were promoted as pure, unfiltered battles of the best against the best, and fans responded. Despite lukewarm attendance at Super Bowl I by Super Bowl III in 1969, the contest was already part of American identity. Joe Namath's famous guarantee and subsequent upset victory over the heavily favored Baltimore Colts captured imaginations nationwide. That game in particular underscored why protecting the league's integrity mattered. People wanted to believe in the drama, the underdog stories, the rivalries, but none of it would matter if fans suspected the outcomes were manipulated. The NFL was not naive, though. They understood the risks of sports betting, organized crime, and player misconduct. So, During the 1970s, the league quietly but firmly expanded its system of checks and balances. Players were given clearer rules about gambling associations, officials were held to stricter standards, and the Commissioner's office developed a closer relationship with federal law enforcement. It was a proactive approach, rather than waiting for scandals to explode. The league tried to make sure potential issues were addressed before they could damage the Super Bowl brand. One fascinating aspect of this era was how the NFL embraced television not just as a medium for broadcasting games, but as a partner in protecting the league's image. Broadcasters like CBS and NBC had as much to lose as the league if the sport's reputation faltered. They poured resources into production values, ensuring the games looked bigger and cleaner than ever. Millions of viewers tuning in each January saw not chaos or controversy, but polished spectacle. That partnership between media and the league created a feedback loop of trust. The more professional the games looked, the more legitimate fans felt the sport was. By the late 1970s and into the 1980s, the Super Bowl was becoming more than just a football game. It was turning into America's annual holiday of sports, culture, and entertainment. Advertisers clamored for airtime. Halftime shows grew more elaborate, and the game became a gathering point for families, friends, and entire communities. The stakes had never been higher, and neither had the pressure to keep the game honest. A single scandal on the sport's biggest stage could have unraveled decades of progress. It's worth noting that other leagues around the world struggled with exactly this issue. Boxing, once America's most-watched sport, had collapsed in public trust due to rampant fixing and mafia ties. Professional wrestling openly transitioned into entertainment because fans stopped believing in its legitimacy. College basketball had suffered through devastating point shaving, scandals in the 1950s and 1960s. Rozelle and the NFL leadership watched these cautionary tales unfold and doubled down on their commitment to keep the Super Bowl unsullied. Fans rewarded that commitment. Ratings soared. By the time Super Bowl XVI rolled around in 1982, the game drew over 80 million viewers, an unprecedented number that confirmed the NFL had succeeded in its mission. In just 15 years, the Super Bowl had transformed from an experiment into the defining stage of American sports. And crucially, fans didn't whisper about fixed outcomes anymore. Instead, they argued over play calls, debated strategies, and cheered for heroes. The conversations of a healthy, trusted sport. The league also cleverly leveraged its growing success to push new initiatives around integrity. For example, the NFL began investing heavily in officiating programs, training referees with the same level of professionalism expected of players. Instant replay, while not introduced until later, was debated during this era as a way to ensure fairness. Public relations campaigns reinforced the idea that the NFL was not just entertaining, but dependable. Each measure reminded fans that the league took their trust seriously. The cultural significance of this shift cannot be overstated. In a country grappling with political scandals, social change, and economic uncertainty during the 1970s, the NFL offered something rare, an institution that people felt they could count on. Every January, they knew the Super Bowl would deliver drama, spectacle, and above all, fairness. That sense of reliability was a sharp contrast to the sport's shaky beginnings. When mobsters and gamblers whispered in the background, by the dawn of the 1980s, the NFL had accomplished something extraordinary. Not only had it survived the scandals of its early years, but it had turned those scars into lessons, creating a product that felt stronger because of what it had overcome. The Super Bowl stood as proof that football could be both thrilling and trustworthy. In doing so, it set a gold standard for professional sports everywhere. The foundation had been laid. The NFL was no longer fighting for survival. It was fighting for dominance. And as the Super Bowl era gained momentum, the league was about to discover just how much influence and responsibility came with becoming America's favorite sport. The 1980s and 1990s represented a period of rapid expansion for the NFL. television contracts reached unprecedented heights. Stadiums filled with fans wearing team merchandise, and the Super Bowl transformed from a championship game into a global entertainment spectacle. Yet behind the glamour and the profits, the league faced challenges that threatened to unravel its carefully constructed image. Drugs, gambling, and broader cultural controversies tested the NFL's resolve and forced it to confront the tension between entertainment, ethics, and responsibility. The drug scandals of the 1980s were among the first major cracks in the NFL's polished exterior. Cocaine use, which was sweeping through America during the decade, infiltrated locker rooms and left several high-profile players battling addiction. The most tragic case came in 1983, when Don Rogers of the Cleveland Browns died of a cocaine overdose just days after being drafted, shocking fans and league officials alike. The NFL, eager to protect its reputation, began rolling out strict substance abuse policies. Commissioner Pete Rozelle and later Paul Tagliabue recognized that drugs not only harmed athletes, but also undermined public trust in the integrity of the sport. The league introduced random testing, suspensions, and treatment programs. But enforcement often faced pushback from players' unions and debates over privacy rights. Still, these policies marked a turning point in the NFL's willingness to directly tackle off-field behavior. Alongside the drug scandals, gambling continued to loom over professional football. Although the league had fought hard since the 1940s to distance itself from betting, the 1980s revived old fears. The 1983 suspension of Paul Hornung and Alex Kara's decades earlier was still a reminder that gambling could devastate careers. In the late 1980s, whispers surfaced again, when several players were investigated for associating with gamblers. By the 1990s, with casinos and lotteries expanding across the United States, the NFL walked a fine line. The league continued to publicly oppose sports betting, arguing that it threatened the purity of competition. Yet privately, executives recognized the rising interest fans had in point spreads and wagers, foreshadowing the modern era where sports gambling would become legal and deeply tied to fan engagement. Drugs and gambling were not the only scandals confronting the NFL during these decades. The league also faced battles over its broader image. The 1980s saw an uptick in violent incidents both on and off the field. Hard-hitting defensive strategies sparked debates about player safety. While rising injury rates, especially concussions, began to raise alarm bells among medical experts. At the same time, issues of domestic violence and criminal behavior by players emerged as recurring storylines in the media. Each headline about a player's off-field actions threatened to chip away at the NFL's brand as a family-friendly sport. The 1990s amplified these struggles as television magnified every controversy. The advent of 24-hour news networks and sports talk radio meant scandals could no longer be contained to local newspapers. The league's image managers had to grapple with a media environment hungry for stories of conflict and downfall. This was particularly evident during high-profile cases like the suspension of Dallas Cowboys stars for drug violations, which collided with the team's dominance on the field and its status as America's team. Fans loved the Cowboys' winning ways, but were equally captivated by the chaos surrounding their players' behavior. Still, despite these scandals, the NFL demonstrated a remarkable ability to weather storms. One of the key reasons was the leadership of Commissioners Pete Rozelle and Paul Tagliabue, who mastered the art of damage control. When scandals broke, the league often moved quickly to issue punishments, hold press conferences, and introduce new policies. The emphasis was always on maintaining credibility with fans, by portraying itself as proactive even when the measures were imperfect. NFL managed to keep scandals from permanently derailing its growth. It is important to note that fans themselves played a role in how scandals were perceived during this era. For many, the drama surrounding drugs, gambling, and player misconduct was overshadowed by the spectacle of the game itself. As long as the Super Bowl continued to deliver unforgettable moments and teams produced thrilling seasons, fans seemed willing to forgive, or at least overlook, the darker headlines. This relationship between the NFL and its fanbase revealed a fascinating truth. Football had become so deeply woven into American culture that even scandals struggled to shake its foundation. The 1980s and 1990s also provided a glimpse into the balancing act the NFL would face in the future. On one side, the league wanted to uphold ideals of fairness, safety, and morality. On the other, it was managing a billion-dollar entertainment industry driven by ratings, ticket sales, and sponsorships. This duality meant the NFL often had to act, both as a strict disciplinarian and as a promoter of larger-than-life personalities, who sometimes found themselves at the center of controversy. Looking back, the scandals of these decades serve as a reminder that the NFL's rise to global dominance was not smooth or uncontested. Drugs, gambling, and image battles all tested the league's ability to protect its reputation while adapting to the changing social and cultural landscape of America. But rather than bringing the NFL down, these challenges forced it to innovate, to refine its policies, and to reinforce its connection with fans who wanted to believe in the game's integrity. And so, as the 20th century drew to a close, the NFL emerged not weakened, but stronger, battle-tested against the forces that might have undone it. The controversies of the 1980s and 1990s became lessons, shaping a league that would enter the 21st century prepared to handle even bigger storms. Because if there was one truth about the NFL, was this: scandals might rattle the league, but football itself remained untouchable in the hearts of millions. Scandals might rattle the league, but football itself remained untouchable in the hearts of millions. The dawn of the 2000s brought with it an entirely new reality for the NFL. By this time, the league had survived bribery scandals, rigged games, mafia whispers, and decades of controversy. What emerged from that turbulent history was not just a football league, but a billion-dollar entertainment empire. The NFL entered the 21st century as the crown jewel of American sports. Its games filled stadiums with tens of thousands of fans every Sunday, while millions more tuned in from around the country and, increasingly, from around the world. But as the money got bigger, so too did the challenges. The NFL of the 2000s was no longer just a football league, it was a global business enterprise. With television contracts worth billions, corporate sponsorships tied to every facet of the game, and a growing emphasis on player branding, the pressure was higher than ever to maintain both integrity and image. At the heart of this transformation was Commissioner Paul Tagliabue, who had taken over after Pete Rozelle, while Rozelle built the foundation of television deals and league legitimacy. Tagliabue presided over the NFL during a period of explosive economic growth and globalization. Under his leadership, the NFL transformed into a marketing powerhouse. But it also faced the pressure of balancing business with integrity. One of the defining stories of the 2000s was the rise of new money. Stadium deals became a centerpiece of the NFL economy, with teams pushing for state-of-the-art arenas filled with luxury suites, club seating, and every modern amenity imaginable. The league was no longer just selling tickets, was selling an experience. Corporate sponsors lined up to attach their names to stadiums, broadcasts, and even instant replays. These deals poured cash into the NFL like never before, creating both opportunity and tension. Owners grew richer, players demanded higher salaries, and the financial stakes of every game rose to staggering levels. The arrival of new money also brought new challenges. For one, the NFL became increasingly scrutinized for its handling of labor disputes. The relationship between players and owners was often tense, as both sides wrestled over revenue sharing and salary caps. The NFL Players Association fought for higher pay and better benefits, while owners resisted, knowing that giving in too much could cut into the profits flowing from billion-dollar TV contracts. At the same time, the league faced new public relations battles. The 2000s brought heightened awareness of player conduct off the field. With the media spotlight brighter than ever, stories of DUI, assaults, and drug use became national headlines within hours. Suddenly, the NFL was not just a sports league, it was a brand. And the actions of individual players could threaten its global image. Scandals that might have gone unnoticed in earlier decades were now magnified by 24-hour cable sports networks and the rise of the internet. The issue of performance-enhancing drugs, PEDs, also loomed large. The NFL, like other major sports leagues, had to grapple with the growing specter of doping. Steroid use was a controversial subject in baseball and the Olympics, and the NFL could not avoid scrutiny. The league introduced stricter testing policies, but fans and critics alike questioned whether enough was being done to protect the integrity of the game. But while scandals existed, the NFL of the 2000s also stood out for its resilience. Each controversy was countered by strategic moves to restore public confidence. One of the most important tools was the expansion of media coverage. Networks like ESPN, Fox, and CBS invested heavily in NFL programming, turning Sundays into all-day spectacles. The NFL Network launched in 2003, creating an around-the-clock hub of football content that kept fans engaged year-round. This explosion of media exposure didn't just report on scandals, it also promoted the league's stars and stories, turning players into household names and making football an ever-present part of American culture. Globalization was another defining challenge of the decade. The NFL made an ambitious push to grow its brand beyond the borders of the United States. The NFL International Series began in 2007, bringing regular season games to London. The move was risky. Would British fans embrace American football the way they did soccer? The answer turned out to be yes. London games sold out quickly, proving there was a global appetite for the sport. This was a pivotal moment in the NFL's history, as it marked the beginning of its transition from a national pastime to a global product. The 2000s also witnessed the rise of fantasy football, a phenomenon that transformed the way fans engaged with the game. Once a niche hobby, fantasy football exploded thanks to the internet. Millions of fans now had a reason to watch every game, not just the ones featuring their favorite team. Fantasy leagues created a new kind of fan engagement, where statistics, player matchups, and Sunday afternoons became a nationwide obsession. In many ways, fantasy football helped bridge the gap between scandals and fandom. It gave fans ownership of the sport in a personal way, making them more invested than ever. Yet, with every success came new pressures. The league was forced to confront player safety in a more serious way. The late 2000s saw growing concerns about concussions and long-term health risks for players. Research began to suggest links between repeated head trauma and serious neurological issues. While this was not yet the defining crisis it would become in the following decade, the conversation was starting to build. The NFL faced a delicate balance, protecting the gladiator-like image of toughness while addressing the growing reality of health risks. Economically, culturally, and socially, the 2000s defined the NFL as more than just a game. It became a global brand, a media powerhouse, and an American export. But the price of success was high. Every scandal had the potential to ripple through billion-dollar deals. Every mistake by a player could dominate headlines. And every hint of corruption or misconduct threatened to undercut decades of progress. Still, the NFL's survival through the 2000s proved one thing above all else. It had become too big to fail. Fans were too passionate, owners were too invested, and the sport was too deeply embedded in American culture. The league's ability to navigate drugs, gambling whispers, labor battles, and image problems demonstrated its resilience. By the end of the decade, the NFL had not only survived, but thrived. Stadiums were bigger, contracts richer, stars brighter, and fans more engaged than ever before. It was a decade of transformation, where the league evolved from an American pastime into a global phenomenon. The scandals of the past had threatened to destroy the league. The scandals of the 2000s tested its strength. But through media power, globalization, and fan engagement, the NFL proved that it could adapt, survive, and continue marching toward the future. By the time the NFL entered the 2010s, it had conquered the cultural landscape. The Super Bowl had become not just a game, but a national holiday. Television networks paid billions for broadcast rights. Fantasy football exploded in popularity, and players were household names across the globe. Yet behind this glossy image of dominance lurked one of the most profound crises in sports history. Concussions, long dismissed as part of the toughness of the game, were beginning to reveal their devastating long-term effects. The acronym CTE, chronic traumatic encephalopathy, was about to change the way fans, players, and even children viewed football forever. The story begins with Dr. Bennett Omalo, the Nigerian-born pathologist whose 2005 research first revealed CTE in the brain of former Pittsburgh Steeler Mike Webster. Though his work initially struggled for recognition, by the early 2010s, it had become impossible to ignore. More former players were being diagnosed after death, and more heartbreaking stories filled the headlines. Retired stars who once inspired crowds were suffering from memory loss, depression, and in some cases, tragic suicides. These stories struck at the very heart of America's favorite game. Could a sport built on collisions survive when fans learned what those hits were really costing? For the NFL, the 2010s became a decade of reckoning. The league could no longer downplay concussions. Public pressure mounted with every news story. Parents began pulling children from youth football programs. Lawmakers began demanding answers. Even Hollywood weighed in with the 2015 film Concussion dramatizing Dr. Omalo's fight to make the truth known. The NFL found itself at the center of a storm, and the stakes were clear. Either adapt and protect its players, or risk losing the trust of its fans. But here's where the NFL's story shifts. Instead of collapsing under scandal, the league responded with sweeping reforms that would reshape not just football, but the entire culture of contact sports. New concussion protocols were introduced, requiring independent neurological evaluations before a player could return to the field. The helmet-to-helmet hits once glorified on highlight reels were penalized heavily, with fines and suspensions to enforce player safety. Kickoffs, one of the most dangerous plays in football, were redesigned to reduce high-speed collisions. Teams invested in advanced helmets and partnered with scientists to improve equipment technology. These moves were not perfect, and critics often said they came too late. But fans saw something important. The NFL was evolving. Instead of ignoring the problem, the league embraced it. By the mid-2010s, every game had unaffiliated neurotrauma consultants on the sidelines. Players who wobbled after a hit were pulled immediately for evaluations. Coaches could no longer pressure athletes into shaking it off and running back onto the field. For the first time in history, the health of players was beginning to come before the spectacle of the game. Of course, controversy persisted. Some fans complained that football was becoming soft. Others argued that the NFL only acted under legal and financial pressure, pointing to the $765 million concussion settlement reached with thousands of former players in 2013. But even within these criticisms lay a deeper truth. The NFL was too valuable, too beloved, and too culturally significant to fail. The league had to find a way to honor both its traditions of toughness and its new commitment to safety. And this balancing act led to innovation. Advances in sports science transformed training and recovery. Data from helmet sensors helped track head impacts. Rule changes reduced unnecessary risks without removing the intensity of the sport. By 2019, youth leagues across the country had adopted heads-up football, a program designed to teach safer tackling techniques from the ground up. The NFL was not just protecting its own stars, was influencing how the next generation would play the game. What makes this chapter of NFL history so fascinating is that it reveals a league capable of learning. In earlier decades, scandals often revolved around hiding the truth. Point shaving, bribes, or gambling swept under the rug. But in the 2010s, the concussion crisis forced the NFL into the open. Fans demanded transparency. Players demanded respect for their health. And the league, under Commissioner Roger Goodell, accepted that protecting its future meant acknowledging uncomfortable truths about its past. The result was a stronger bond between players and fans. When stars like Troy Aikman, Kurt Warner, and later Andrew Luck spoke openly about their health concerns, fans didn't abandon them, they supported them. When big hits were flagged, most fans began to understand why. Football remained thrilling, but it also became responsible. And in this sense, the concussion era did not kill the game. It helped secure its survival. The decade also produced some of the most unforgettable football ever played. Despite the controversies, fans packed stadiums. TV ratings soared. Legendary moments from the Seahawks' Super Bowl 48 domination to the Patriots' miraculous comeback in Super Bowl 51, why they loved the sport. The concussion crisis may have shaken the league, but it did not define it. Instead, it became the spark for reform, the catalyst for a safer, smarter NFL. By the end of the 2010s, even as medical research on CTE continued, the NFL had proven its resilience. The league's investments in player health, equipment, and education showed a willingness to adapt. Football was still dangerous. No sport involving collisions could ever be completely safe, but fans could trust that the league was no longer looking the other way. The NFL was facing its challenges head-on, just like the athletes who make the game great. And that is what makes the story of the 2010s remarkable. The NFL did not simply survive the concussion crisis, it emerged with a renewed identity. No longer just a showcase of raw power, it became a sport that valued longevity, science, and humanity. Players were not just gladiators. They were people with futures, families, and legacies. Fans were not just spectators. They were partners in demanding accountability and celebrating progress. The fight for player safety continues into today, but the 2010s proved something essential. The NFL is more than the scandals that threatened it. It is a game of resilience, transformation, and unity. Just as the league survived bribery, gambling, and mafia ties in its early years, it survived concussions and CTE in the modern age. Football remains America's game because it adapts, it learns, and it refuses to give up. The last decade left us with a clear message. The NFL story is not just about the hits on the field, it's about the progress off it. And in facing its greatest health crisis, the league demonstrated the same grit and determination that makes football the most inspiring sport in the world. For decades, the NFL treated gambling as a dangerous shadow lurking at the edges of professional football. It was whispered about, feared, and often denied. The league's first commissioner, Bert Bell, once said that gambling was the one absolute threat that could destroy the sport. And after the 1946 betting scandal and later point-shaving controversies in college football, his warning wasn't paranoia, it was reality. But as the 21st century unfolded, a seismic cultural shift took place. What was once taboo began to transform into the very engine of fan engagement, sponsorship, and billions of dollars in new revenue. The modern gambling story of the NFL is one of remarkable irony. The league that fought so hard to keep betting at arm's length eventually built some of its most profitable partnerships around it. And it was not just about sportsbooks. Fantasy football and daily fantasy contests rewired how fans consumed the sport. It wasn't just about watching your team anymore. Suddenly, fans had players from every roster to root for. Every Sunday became an interconnected puzzle. And the NFL's television ratings soared to new heights. Fantasy football's roots stretch back to the 1960s, when a group of friends in Oakland, including Raiders part owner Bill Winkenbach, created a system to draft players and track their statistics. At first, it was a niche hobby, confined to office leagues and handwritten scorecards. But in the internet age, fantasy football became an unstoppable force. By the early 2000s, websites like ESPN, Yahoo, and NFL.com themselves offered free fantasy leagues that drew millions of participants. By the end of the decade, fantasy football had become a cultural ritual dominating conversations in workplaces, campuses, and living rooms across America. The NFL noticed. Fantasy football didn't just make fans more invested, made them watch more games. A Monday night contest between two struggling teams. Suddenly, millions of people tuned in, desperate to see if their wide receiver would score a crucial touchdown. Every game had meaning. Every yard mattered. Fantasy football became the ultimate ratings magnet, and the league leaned into it with official partnerships, apps, and even fantasy-focused studio shows. But as fantasy football cemented itself as part of the fan experience, another giant wave was on the horizon: legalized sports betting. For decades, Nevada had been the only state with widespread legal sports betting. But in 2018, the U.S. Supreme Court struck down the Professional and Amateur Sports Protection Act, PASPA, a law that had restricted sports gambling across most of the country. Overnight, the landscape changed. States were free to legalize and regulate sports betting, and many did so eagerly, sensing the massive tax revenues that came with it. The NFL, which had historically taken a hardline stance against gambling, now faced a decision. For years, the league refused to even allow Las Vegas to advertise during the Super Bowl, fearing any association with betting would tarnish its image. But after PASPA was overturned, the floodgates opened. The NFL pivoted, embracing betting partnerships with companies like DraftKings, FanDuel, and Caesars Entertainment. The very activity once described as a mortal threat to the sport had become one of its most lucrative allies. This transformation was not without its challenges. Critics worried that the embrace of betting would lead to a new era of scandals, players shaving points, referees influenced by betting lines, or fans losing faith in the purity of the game. But the league doubled down on transparency, partnering with data companies to monitor suspicious betting patterns and implementing strict policies for players and staff. In the NFL's narrative, legalized sports betting wasn't a risk, it was a safeguard against the corruption of the underground market. What made this shift so fascinating was how it tied directly into the NFL's broader strategy of fan engagement. Fantasy football had already trained millions of fans to track stats, think strategically, and root for specific outcomes beyond just wins and losses. Betting was the natural extension of that. A fan could now place a wager on whether a quarterback would throw for 300 yards, or if a kicker would nail a game-winning field goal. Every snap became an opportunity, every drive a chance to win. The result? Ratings climbed even higher. Younger audiences became more engaged, and the NFL entered partnerships worth billions of dollars. By the 2020s, the sight of betting ads during games was commonplace. Stadiums even began to feature betting lounges, and sportsbooks partnered with teams directly. What once lived in the shadows was now front and center. Still, the NFL has had to balance this growth with integrity. The league has suspended players for violating gambling policies, making it clear that betting on one's own sport was absolutely forbidden. The high-profile suspensions of players like Calvin Ridley showed that while the NFL embraced betting revenue, it would not compromise its image of fairness and competition. It was a line the league knew it could not cross. Yet for fans, the impact has been undeniable. Fantasy football and legalized betting turned the NFL into not just America's most popular sport, but America's most interactive sport. Fans don't just watch games, they play alongside them, making decisions, tracking stats, and living the drama in real time. This level of immersion created a loyalty that few other sports can replicate. What is remarkable is how the NFL reframed the narrative. In the 1940s, gambling nearly destroyed professional football. In the 1960s, point shaving rocked college sports. For decades, betting was the great enemy. But by the 2020s, it had become one of the league's greatest strengths. The story of gambling and the NFL is not one of collapse, but of transformation a reminder that the league's survival has always been tied to its ability to adapt. And this adaptation has proven wildly successful. The NFL is now positioned not just as a sports league, but as the centerpiece of an entertainment ecosystem where fans can watch, play fantasy, wager, and engage across platforms. What began as a shadowy threat has become a cornerstone of growth. The NFL's ability to turn gambling from scandal to strategy, from risk to reward, is one of the most important chapters in its history. It shows a league that never stopped evolving, never stopped finding ways to connect with fans, and never stopped turning obstacles into opportunities. And as we move forward, the question remains: what will be the next great challenge the NFL transforms into triumph? The 2020s have brought a new layer of complexity to the NFL. It is no longer just about the game on the field. Instead, the league now exists at the intersection of sports, culture, politics, and business on a global scale. With social media amplifying every decision, every misstep, and every triumph, the NFL is under more scrutiny than at any point in its history. Yet at the same time, it has never been more powerful, more profitable, or more followed around the world. This decade is proving that scandals and controversies will never vanish completely, but redemption and resilience continue to define the NFL's journey forward. When the decade began, the world was hit with an unexpected crisis: the COVID-19 pandemic. Suddenly, stadiums were empty, training facilities were shut down, and the idea of holding a season seemed impossible. Many critics thought football would either not survive or would become a shell of itself. Yet the league responded with strict testing protocols, schedule reshuffling, and innovative use of technology. Teams held meetings virtually, stadiums experimented with artificial crowd noise, and television broadcasts reached record audiences from fans who were starved for a sense of normalcy. In the end, the NFL not only survived the pandemic's early impact, it thrived. Super Bowl LV in February 2021 symbolized resilience, played in front of a limited crowd but watched by over 90 million on television. The pandemic tested the league's adaptability, and the NFL showed that it could adjust and overcome while keeping fans engaged in a difficult time. But alongside these victories, controversies arrived. One of the most publicized stories of the 2020s involved high-profile coaches and executives caught in email scandals. The exposure of offensive, discriminatory messages from figures like John Gruden ignited debates about league culture, accountability, and inclusion. Critics accused the NFL of selective punishment and questioned whether the league was transparent enough. For fans, it was a reminder that football exists in the real world, where social issues and professional behavior collide. The controversy was damaging, but it also led to deeper discussions about diversity and respect in leadership positions. At the same time, player behavior continued to dominate headlines. Off-field incidents involving DOIs, altercations, or questionable decisions received massive media attention. In decades past, these might have been local stories. But in the age of Twitter and Instagram, one mistake can become international news within minutes. The NFL faced criticism for inconsistent punishments, with some fans believing star players received lighter penalties than role players. These debates fueled broader questions. How should a league balance protecting its image with offering second chances to players who make mistakes? Yet for every scandal, the 2020s have also produced powerful redemption stories. Players who once seemed written off returned stronger than ever. Take Antonio Brown, for example, a player whose career was nearly lost to controversy, yet he managed to return to the field, win a Super Bowl with Tampa Bay, and briefly repair his reputation before new challenges arose. Or consider players suspended for gambling violations who used the opportunity to rebuild themselves as role models once reinstated. Fans are often divided on these stories, but they highlight an important truth. The NFL is not just about wins and losses, it is also about second chances and personal growth. One of the most fascinating developments of this decade has been the rapid embrace of legalized sports betting. For decades, gambling was treated as a threat to the league's very existence. Today, it is one of its biggest revenue streams. Partnerships with companies like DraftKings, FanDuel, and Caesars have transformed the way fans consume the game. Betting lines are now openly discussed on broadcasts. Stadiums feature sportsbook lounges. And fantasy football has merged with real money gambling to create year-round engagement. Yet this new frontier has not been without controversy. Several players, including rising stars, have been suspended for violating gambling policies. The league is now walking a tightrope, promoting betting as entertainment while protecting the integrity of the sport. The 2020s have also forced the NFL to navigate political and social controversies. Issues like racial justice, player protests during the national anthem, and debates over player safety continue to generate heated arguments among fans and commentators. The league has responded by increasing its community outreach, funding social justice initiatives and promoting causes through campaigns like Inspire Change. While not every fan agrees with these efforts, they show the NFL's attempt to evolve in step with broader cultural conversations. The league understands that it cannot remain silent in a world where athletes have become powerful voices for change. On the field, the NFL has faced image battles of its own. The taunting rule changes, roughing the passer penalties, and controversial officiating decisions have frustrated fans who feel the game is becoming overregulated. Social media amplifies every blown call, creating weekly storms of criticism. Yet, despite these flare-ups, ratings remain strong. Fans may complain, but they keep watching. That loyalty is the NFL's greatest strength, and it gives the league room to make adjustments while learning from mistakes. Perhaps the most dramatic scandal of the 2020s was the collapse of Damar Hamlin on live television in January 2023. The Buffalo Bills safety suffered cardiac arrest during a Monday Night Football game, sending shockwaves across the sports world. For a moment, the NFL was forced to confront the fragility of the human body and the real dangers of the game. But what followed was not just fear. It was unity. Players, fans, and teams across the league rallied together, raising millions for Hamlin's charity and creating one of the most powerful redemption stories in NFL history. Hamlin's recovery and return to the field became a symbol of resilience, reminding the world why football matters. It brings people together in moments of both joy and pain. The decade has also been shaped by stories of personal redemption outside the field. Coaches once disgraced have found new opportunities. Players battling addiction or mental health challenges have opened up publicly, breaking stigmas and encouraging others to seek help. The NFL has partnered with organizations to promote mental health awareness, understanding that its influence reaches far beyond the stadium. These positive steps show that scandals do not have to define careers. Redemption is possible, and fans respond strongly to those who show growth and humility. Financially, the NFL has never been stronger. Billion-dollar TV deals with networks and streaming platforms have expanded its global footprint. Games in London, Mexico City, and now Germany are part of the league's strategy to grow worldwide. This global reach means that controversies in the NFL are no longer just American stories. They are international headlines. But it also means that redemption stories have global impact. A player's comeback, a team's turnaround, or a league-wide act of unity now resonates with fans from Europe to Asia to South America. The 2020s may still be unfolding, but the decade has already proven that the NFL remains a reflection of society. Scandals and controversies are unavoidable in a league this massive. Yet the ability to turn those low points into redemption arcs is what keeps fans invested. From the pandemic to player protests, from gambling suspensions to medical miracles, the NFL continues to walk a fine line between chaos and triumph. But at every step, it has shown one undeniable truth. The shield may be tested, but it never breaks. And as we move forward, the stories of this decade will be remembered not just for the controversies that shook the league, but for the resilience, unity, and comebacks that reminded the world why the NFL is more than just a game. It is a story of redemption, written week after week, year after year. Today, when fans sit down on a Sunday afternoon and flip on the television, what they see is not just a football game, the product of over a century of struggle, scandal, resilience, and reform. The modern NFL is a shining example of what happens when an institution faces its darkest moments and chooses not only to survive, but to learn and evolve. From the whispers of corruption and rigged games in its earliest days, to the media explosions of scandals in the 1980s, 1990s, and 2000s, the NFL has weathered storms that could have ended any other league. Yet here it stands, stronger than ever, because the lessons of the past have become the foundation of the future. One of the most significant lessons learned has been the necessity of transparency. In the 1920s and 1930s, when whispers of bribery and fixed games emerged, there were no safeguards, no league-wide investigations, and no real communication with the public. This secrecy eroded trust and nearly cost professional football its legitimacy. Fast forward to today, and the NFL now operates under a microscope, where investigations are publicized, commissioner press conferences are broadcast worldwide, and accountability is demanded instantly by millions of fans across social media. This level of transparency, while at times uncomfortable, has ensured that the NFL is no longer just reacting to scandals, it is actively working to prevent them. Another vital lesson has been the importance of player welfare. For decades, players were treated as expendable commodities, with little attention given to their long-term health. But the concussion crisis and the revelations of CTE changed everything. Fans, families, and even players themselves demanded more. The league responded by introducing stricter concussion protocols, investing millions in helmet technology, partnering with medical experts, creating a culture that emphasizes health and safety first. Is the system perfect? No, but it is leagues ahead of where it once was, and that ongoing evolution shows the NFL's willingness to adapt. The result has been a sport that is still as thrilling as ever, but far more conscious of the men who risk everything on the field. The NFL has also learned the value of embracing change rather than resisting it. The legalization of sports betting, for instance, once seemed like a nightmare scenario that could reignite the scandals of the 1940s. Instead, the league has chosen to embrace the moment, creating partnerships with major betting platforms, introducing official rules to monitor integrity, and ensuring fans can enjoy betting as an entertainment extension of the game, rather than denying the inevitable. The NFL recognized the cultural shift and harnessed it in a way that strengthens both revenue and fan engagement. Equally important has been the league's effort to address social issues and diversity. The NFL of decades past often looked the other way when confronted with questions of race, inclusion, and representation. Today, the league knows it cannot afford to remain silent. From supporting players who raise awareness about social justice, to promoting minority hiring initiatives, to championing women in leadership roles, the NFL has taken strides toward being more inclusive. There's still progress to be made, but the fact that these issues are openly acknowledged and tackled head-on shows how much the league has matured since its earliest days of silence and avoidance. Perhaps the most remarkable transformation is how the NFL has become a global phenomenon. In the 1920s, it was a regional league struggling for credibility against baseball and college football. Today, the NFL fills stadiums in London, Munich, and Mexico City, streams games to millions of fans worldwide, and has plans for further international expansion. This global stage comes with new challenges: maintaining integrity, ensuring fairness across borders, and growing responsibly. It also highlights how far the league has come from its scandal-ridden infancy. What was once seen as a niche sport for American towns has become a worldwide spectacle, drawing attention and respect on a level the founding fathers of football never could have imagined. Fans today benefit from all of these lessons. When you watch Patrick Mahomes pull off a miracle throw or Aaron Donald crash through an offensive line, not just witnessing athletic greatness. You re-watching the product of a system that has learned to prioritize fairness, safety, transparency, and trust. The fact that we can celebrate those plays without doubting whether the game is rigged or corrupted is proof of how far the NFL has come. Looking to the future, the NFL faces challenges that will test whether these lessons hold. Technology will reshape how fans experience the game, from virtual reality viewing to advanced AI-driven officiating. Player activism will continue to influence how the league responds to societal changes. And new markets, from Africa to Asia, will push the NFL to expand its reach while maintaining its identity. The league will also need to ensure that it never becomes complacent, because history shows what happens when accountability is ignored. But if the past century has proven anything, it is that the NFL has the resilience and adaptability to thrive no matter what comes its way. Scandals once threatened to destroy it, but instead, they forged a stronger institution. Mistakes once threatened fan trust, but they became the catalysts for reform. And every time the NFL was forced to confront its flaws, it chose growth over denial. That is why the league we see today is not just surviving, bigger and better than ever. As fans, we should see the modern NFL not just as entertainment, but as a story of perseverance. It's a reminder that even when corruption, greed, and scandal lurk in the shadows, what matters most is how an institution responds. And the NFL has shown that through strong leadership, accountability, and an unwavering dedication to the game, it can turn its darkest moments into opportunities for greatness. So the next time you hear the roar of the crowd or watch a game-winning drive unfold under the lights, remember this: the NFL you're celebrating today exists because of the lessons learned yesterday. It is a league that has been tested, scarred, and doubted, yet it has emerged stronger than ever. And if history is any guide, its future will be just as thrilling, just as unpredictable, and just as unforgettable as the game itself. The story of the National Football League is not just the story of touchdowns, trophies, and dynasties. It is the story of a game that almost didn't survive. From its earliest days, when bribes, fixed matches, and whispers of Mafia influence cast long shadows over the field, the NFL stood dangerously close to collapse. Yet, against all odds, it endured. The league faced corruption, scandal, and doubt, but each challenge became a turning point that reshaped football into something stronger, more resilient, and far more trusted by the millions who love it today. When fans pack stadiums on Sundays or gather around televisions across the world, they are witnessing more than a game. They are experiencing the living product of a century-long battle for credibility. Those early scandals of the 1920s and 1930s may have nearly destroyed football, but they also forced the sport to recognize the importance of integrity. Without those painful lessons, without those moments of near ruin, the league might never have grown into the cultural powerhouse we know now. The tale of the 1946 betting scandal, the most dangerous episode of its early life, remains one of the clearest examples of how close the NFL came to disaster. Two star players risking it all for a quick payout could have crippled the league's reputation permanently. Instead, the NFL confronted the scandal directly, taking swift disciplinary action that made clear this was a league that would not tolerate dishonor. That resolve laid the foundation for future commissioners, most notably Pete Rozelle, who understood that protecting the shield was as important as protecting the game itself. By the 1960s and 1970s, Rozelle's leadership transformed the NFL into more than a sport. TET became an institution of trust. Through strict policies, decisive punishments, and an unwavering commitment to transparency, he restored public faith. Just as important, he paired integrity with innovation, forging media partnerships that made the NFL not only credible, but also wildly popular. Games weren't just contests anymore. They were spectacles shared by millions. The Super Bowl, born out of this vision, became a stage that showcased not only athletic greatness, but also the reliability of the league's values. Of course, challenges didn't disappear. The 1980s and 1990s brought new scandals: drug abuse, gambling rumors, and image battles that threatened to shake the NFL's clean image. Yet, the league met those moments the same way it had met the earlier crises, with reform, discipline, and an understanding that football's future depended on more than what happened between the goalposts. It depended on maintaining the trust of the fans. As the league entered the 2000s and 2010s, the spotlight grew even brighter. With global audiences watching, even the smallest misstep could dominate headlines. The concussion crisis revealed cracks in the system, showing that even in its dominance, the NFL still had blind spots. But instead of ignoring the problem, the league invested heavily in research, safety protocols, and awareness campaigns. What could have been a fatal blow became a chance for the NFL to lead not just in entertainment, but in responsibility. And then came the modern era, where gambling, once the league's greatest enemy, re-emerged as one of its newest partnerships. Legalized sports betting and the rise of fantasy football changed the way fans interact with the game. It was a delicate balance. The NFL had to embrace a changing sports economy while also remembering the lessons of its past. History had shown that unchecked gambling nearly destroyed football once. Now, it had to ensure that this new chapter remained transparent, regulated, and fair. And to its credit, the NFL has leaned into oversight, ensuring that fans can enjoy this new dimension of the game without fear of corruption. Scandals still surface in the 2020s, from off-field controversies involving players to debates about league decisions. The NFL remains under constant scrutiny. But here lies the difference between then and now. The NFL no longer teeters on the edge of collapse. It has built a foundation of resilience, backed by history and reinforced by lessons learned. Each new controversy sparks conversation, reform, and most importantly proof that the league is strong enough to confront its flaws openly. Today, the NFL stands not just as a sports league, but as a symbol of growth through adversity. Its history of scandals is not something to bury, it's something to learn from. Those moments of weakness gave rise to systems of strength. Those times of doubt built the resolve to win back trust. Every era of controversy prepared the NFL for the challenges of the next, ensuring that the Shield would not just survive, but thrive. And what does this mean for fans? It means that every touchdown, every upset, every championship parade represents more than the glory of the moment. It represents a century of resilience, of a league that refused to be defined by its lowest points. Fans can take pride in knowing that the NFL has grown alongside them, facing challenges honestly, transforming setbacks into comebacks, and always pushing forward. The journey from scandal to stability is not over. The NFL's future will bring new challenges, new controversies, new pressures, and new questions. But if history has proven anything, it is that this league is built on resilience. It has endured bribery scandals, mafia whispers, betting schemes, drug epidemics, concussion crises, and global criticism, and it has emerged stronger every time. The NFL's first scandals could have killed the game. Instead, they forged the identity of a league that is now the most popular sport in America and a cultural force around the world. That is the legacy of football. Not perfection, but perseverance. Not scandal, but survival. Not corruption, but the courage to rebuild trust time and again. And so, as fans look to the future, one truth stands above all. The NFL is not just a game. It is a story of resilience, a reminder that greatness is not about never falling. It is about always rising again. From its earliest scandals to its global dominance today, football has shown us the power of second chances, the importance of integrity, and the unshakable bond between a league and the fans who never stopped believing in it. The Shield has been tested, but it has never been broken. And that is why the NFL, more than any scandal, will always endure.